Yeah, I'm Michael Brown, President of School for Advanced Research, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this 2022 President's Lecture, featuring writer and historian Dan Flores, drawing on his new book, Wild New World, which was just, by the way, named Best Book or on the Best Book list of Kirkus Reviews, one of the industry's most important publications. Tonight's presentation will include selected readings and a presentation by Dan, followed by a discussion between historian Sara Dant and Dan, with questions submitted from the audience as well as ones that Sara will pose to Dan. The program will end with a final reading by Dan. His presentation and discussions draw from this new book an ambitious big history of how humans responded to the great bestiary of the American creatures that emerged in the wake of the Chicxulub Impact. That was a giant asteroid that hit the Gulf of Mexico. You probably knew that, but I had to study how it's pronounced. The Wild New World is a narrative history that begins in deep time and extends to the present. Before I introduce our speakers tonight, I'd like to thank our generous sponsors who made the event possible. They include the Palo Hemo Foundation, Adobo Catering, the Flora Crichton Lecture Fund, the Luke and Betty Vortman Endowment Fund, members of SAR's Founder Society, Newman's Own Foundation, Thornburg Investment Management, Santa Fe Dining, Dan Marion's UBS Financial Services, and Collected Works Bookstore and Coffee House. You may have noticed the Collected Works has copies of both Dan's and Sara's books for sale, and they will be available for purchase and autographing after the event. But do please allow them to be sprung at some point so that they can have dinner. They will have sung for their supper, and we don't want to keep them away from dinner too late. I also want to recognize members of our board of directors who are here tonight. We greatly appreciate their support and commitment to SAR's mission. Events like these are made possible by our donors, including our board members, and if you'd like information on becoming an SAR member, I assume that you all are, right? So this is, I assume I'm preaching to the choir, but if you're interested in upgrading your membership, go to our website and you can get additional information on membership. I'm pleased to make one announcement, a late-breaking bit of programming news. I'm pleased to announce that we have today confirmed that on April 13th, 2023, SAR will host an event here at the Lensic that will feature Harvard professor and PBS star Henry Louis Gates Jr., who will be in conversation with Professor Andrew Curran. The title of the event is The Invention of Race, The Origin of an Idea. This builds on their recently published book, Who's Black and Why? A hidden chapter from the 18th century invention of race. If you want information on that, just pick this up on your way out. It's got the date and the time on the card. Now to introduce our speakers. Dan Flores, PhD, is a New Mexico-based writer and professor emeritus of the history of the American West at the University of Montana, Missoula. He's the author of 10 books, including the New York Times bestseller Coyote America, A Natural and Supernatural History, as well as the Amazon bestseller American Serengeti, which was the winner of the Studendijk Distinguished Book Prize some years ago. Sara Dant, PhD, is the Brady Presidential Distinguished Professor and Chair of History at Weber State University in Utah. Her work focuses on environmental politics in the United States, with an emphasis on the creation and development of consensus and bipartisanship. It's kind of a scarce resource, but I'm glad she's working on it. Her latest book is Losing Eden, An Environmental History of an American West, which is about the interaction between people and nature in our region. She's also an advisor and interviewee on Ken Burns' The American Buffalo documentary film, and author of several articles on Western environmental politics. Before I invite them out, a friendly reminder. Please mute or turn off your cell phones, iPads, electronic watches, drones, and any other electronic devices that you may have with you. Enjoy the presentation. Please join me in welcoming Dan and Sara. Sure. Looking forward to it.
So let me first make sure you can hear me. Is it working? Okay, very good. I will also say that the scene behind me is a scene from the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge from a very specific morning, the day after summer solstice 2019. And some of the people who were along on that trip are in the room here. So I hope this conjures up sweet memories for you of the Hula Hula River and the porcupine caribou herd migrating through that marvelous part of the world. So let me start by saying this, and the way we're going to do this, as Michael indicated, is I'm going to give you a few minutes of information about the book, how it came to be, some of the themes that are in it. And once I do that, I'm going to then read the first page and a half of the book. And as you'll see, there's a specific reason for that, especially here in New Mexico. And then I'll go sit, and Sarah and I, Dr. Dan and I, will proceed to have a conversation about Wild New World. But I want to begin simply by saying this, to put everything in context. Global climate change is not the first time humanity has remade this planet. Wild New World was inspired by Jared Diamond's books and by Yuval Harari's Sapiens, which I'm sure many of you have read. So when you think about this book, think of it in those terms. It's written as a historical and scientific narrative that covers a span from 66 million years ago, from the time of the Chicxulub Impact, down to early 2022, just a few months ago, in fact. So it's what's known as a big history, as opposed to the kinds of histories most of us are used to reading about specific events in more conventional or modern times. It was a daunting project. It was my pandemic vacation book, frankly. But one of the things I tried to do with it, and I think my publisher agreed with me on this, was to tell this story in fewer than 400 pages. A reader-friendly length, in other words. So I will say that for those of you who might be disappointed that your particular favorite animal didn't make Wild New World, or that I don't spend enough time talking about contemporary management issues, the reason has a lot to do with the fact that I was trying to hold the book to this kind of reader-friendly length. To tell you a little bit more about the writing of it, I was an English major as an undergrad. So I'm drawn to writing narrative and relying on storytelling and character development to advance the plot of a book. But as I continued my education, I ended up in history and specialized particularly in the history of environmental issues, which of course means that you have to do quite a bit of work in science, and you read a lot in a variety of different fields. When I wrote Wild New World, I also tended to follow the lead of another writer I admire. Some of you perhaps have read some of his work. Kim Stanley Robinson, who is a science fiction writer out of California, is another English major like me, but his work also rests substantially on cutting-edge science. So this is why Wild New World is the kind of wide-ranging book it is. Now I'll tell you something about the origins of this book, and I've never been able to say this about a book before, but this particular book dates to my oldest memory in this world. Among the stories in the pages of Wild New World early on, and primarily to help readers understand the ideology that old worlders, Europeans, brought to America about the relationship between humans and animals, I tell this story of when I was 4 years old. As I said, it's my oldest memory, and I had my first animal companion then, a little yellow chicken I fed and watered and played with. Our primary play, when you're a 4-year-old, this is about all you can do, I suppose, was chase. But one day as we raced through the house, I miscalculated and stepped on my chicken and killed her. As we were burying my little yellow chicken, I turned to my mom in the backyard, both of us sobbing, with this question: Mom, so I still get to have Chickie in heaven, don't I? A good Southern Methodist, she responded with a take on the Western view of animals that frankly has ended up haunting me for much of my life. And I think probably set in motion what ultimately became Wild New World. I also wrote Wild New World for another reason. I've long been stunned that we Americans seem to remember so little about the marvelous biological diversity our continent once held, or understand the realities of how we lost so much magic from the world. Most of us recall a kind of shorthand story that once there were millions of buffalo and then there were almost none. But who remembers that 2 centuries ago, Atlantic shorelines still harbored a northern hemisphere penguin, the great auk? That there was still an eastern prairie chicken, known as the heath hen, until the early 1930s. When my grandparents were alive, back in Louisiana, where I grew up, passenger pigeons, once the most numerous bird, not just in America, but on Earth, still flew through American skies. As they had done for 5 million years, a century ago, wolves were still engineering our ecologies. America's own parrot, the Carolina parakeet, continued to lend tropical color to eastern forests only 90 years ago. Ivory-bill woodpeckers, our candidate for the largest woodpecker in the world, were yet available for ornithologists to study into the early 1940s. Henry David Thoreau once lamented that in 1850s New England, he was not able to experience what he called an entire heaven and an entire earth. But precious few modern Americans seem to understand what having an entire earth here might actually have meant. That absence of memory doesn't just make restoration of wolves, for example, more difficult in our time. It sometimes makes me wonder about our willingness to forget our impacts on earth, and whether humans of the 23rd century will even understand that they live on an earth previous generations overheated, or wonder what the planet once was like and why or how it changed. Perhaps there'll be some Thoreau of the 23rd century to wonder about that. But most of us somehow seem to go through our lives thinking that everything is completely normal. I tend to believe, though, that to understand reality, we really have a profound need to know where we've come from. A book that engages the span of time that I take on in Wild New World obviously covers a lot of topics. And so I'll give you a quick little sense of some of the ones that have stood out to me once the book was done. Among one of the themes, obviously, is how America acquired the rich, distinctive bestiary that greeted the first human arrivals here. Humanity's deep time, close relationships with other animals is another theme, manifest in surprising ways that are still part of our neurological and limbic wiring. The book investigates American elephants and why we no longer have them. how a people who established our first coast-to-coast culture 13,000 years ago, one that lasted longer than the United States has, Clovicia the Beautiful is what I call it in the book, forever transformed ecologies on the continent. How it was that in the 10,000 years that followed that, native people largely managed to preserve biological diversity in America. How naturalists, with names like Mark Catesby, William Bartram, John James Audubon, Ernest Thompson Seton, Vernon Bailey and Florence Merriam Bailey, Adolph and Olaus Murie, Aldo Leopold, and Rachel Carson unlocked the secrets of America's wild animals. Why, from the first, Americans were so committed by their religions and old world traditions to destroying the continent's wolves. Why bison aren't wild animals in modern America. And how, in the process of creating what we've long called the greatest nation on earth, America's market-based economy made possible 400 years of the most widespread orgiastic destruction of animals in world history, and then pronounced that an act of civilization. Part of my story involves a theory of first contact. So let me tell you a little bit about that. The Americas were the last continents on earth that humans found as we migrated out of Africa. And we were repeatedly new to the place. First contact theory assumes that beings can only respond to the new with the ideas already in their heads. So first contact in several forms: biological first contact, where animals with no prior experience with us had to learn to fear us, and cultural first contact, when Europeans and native people engaged in big conceptual misses about one another, play significant roles in Wild New World. But I also write about another kind of first contact, which I call continental first contact, where Americans across the last 5 centuries failed to appreciate the vastly diverse and ancient ecologies they inherited. Acting on old world traditions we brought to the continent, we strove to remake America in the image of European nations that had long before destroyed almost all of their own charismatic animals. And even when the United States created a system of vast public lands, unlike anything Europe possessed, with respect to wild animals, we've still struggled to imagine our way out of the blinders of continental first contact. Those thoughts that are in our heads make up another theme that tracks through the book. I'm concerned throughout with how humans see themselves in relation to the other animals inhabiting our world. That story ranges across human time and includes both Neanderthal practices plus the stunning 35,000-year-old art of godlike animals on the cave walls of Western Europe. Our oldest worship often featured imagery of what anthropologists call therianthropes, figures that merge humans and lions or bison into a singular creature. I continue to trace that ancient feeling of kinship between ourselves and other creatures. We are them and they are us through 10,000 Native American years prior to the arrival of Old Worlders here 500 years ago, with accounts of kinship ceremonies that Native people performed to placate their animal deities, so that when humans overreached or failed to pay proper respect, their ceremonies could repair any rifts, so that when called on again, the animals came dancing. Having domesticated many Old World species thousands of years back, Europeans arrived with very different religious ideas. Ideas that sprang from a long tradition of herding animals. From Greek and biblical sources, Europeans believed they were made in the image of a deity that lived in the sky, and were convinced as a result that they possessed a magical but immortal spirit, and thus were exceptional among all beings on earth. That distance between them and us helped make it possible for Europeans to see the wild creatures of America as little more than natural resources and commodities in the global market economy of the colonial world. Seeing a correct human relationship to other animals was never that difficult, it seems, in the first couple million years of our evolution. But in an early U.S. where its citizens believed animals should be sources of capitalist wealth, who believed extinction was impossible because a deity had made the world perfect and unchanging, cracking this dam of old world certitude to see reality eventually required a genius like Charles Darwin, whose blockbuster books finally reveal the great secrets of evolution. Most importantly, of course, that like the life around us, we too are spawn of Earth's evolutionary river. The first of those books, On the Origin of Species, appeared a mere 163 years ago, however. And the inertia of human exceptionalism remains a powerful current in our culture even through today. Finally, what we call the sixth extinction, and here's another theme that I track through most of the book. What we call the sixth extinction today has different origins than most of us assume. Unlike the fifth extinction, whose Chicxulub asteroid strike wiped out 75% of Earth's life in a few weeks, the sixth extinction is anthropogenic and has unspooled in slow motion across the last 25,000 years. A 2018 National Academy of Sciences study described the loss of 300 mammal species and 2.5 billion years of distinctive genetics lost as humans spread around the earth, which this article posited was close to a worst-case scenario of loss in biological diversity. Then, starting 5 centuries ago, at the beginning of the modern world, species like passenger pigeons, which had been entirely healthy in America for 15 million years, proved unable to survive a mere 4 centuries as targets of market capitalism. Since 1500, humans have taken out another 500,000 years of Earth's evolved faunal genetics. There have been 3 books that have tried to do what I attempt with Wild New World, and I should mention them to you. The first was William Temple Hornaday's book, Our Vanishing Wildlife, published by this one-man Endangered Species Act conservationist back at the turn of the century. The book appeared in 1913. A second book that's done something like Wild New World, or at least close to it, was Peter Matheson's Wildlife in America, which is a wonderful regional guide to American nature with a good amount of colonial history thrown in, written in the late 1950s. And the third was Australian Tim Flannery's 2002 book, The Eternal Frontier. Flannery, who is a paleontologist, wrote a book that's especially good on America before the arrival of humans. Beyond those, of course, there are a great many specialists who've written about particular parts of the story I tell in this book, and I unhesitatingly relied on the best of all of those. In addition to being a narrative, though, different in form from the books I've just mentioned, Wild New World is based on up-to-the-moment research. This offers the advantage of calling on a brand new science that we have that can tell us an awful lot. Genomic science, which has emerged in only the last 2 decades, has been providing previously unsuspected information on America's animals. Using museum specimens that preserve DNA, this new science has been able to assess the genetic health of mammoths, great auks, passenger pigeons, and Carolina parakeets on the very eve of their extinction, and then has gone on to identify the likely causes for their disappearance. Genomic science done for the last American mammoths, who survived on Wrangel Island in the Bering Sea down to 4,000 years ago, has given us a new window into the extinctions at the end of the Pleistocene 10,000 years ago. And finally, genomic science has fascinating new things to tell us about our own origins, including our origins as wild animals ourselves. So I'll conclude this little presentation about the book by simply saying this to you. Despite laying out a history, as I've done here, that sounds a little bit like an elegy, this is actually an optimistic book. When we needed a Hail Mary to slow and even reverse what seemed like unstoppable forces of destruction, we Americans actually managed it. And I'll talk about that later on in the evening. That gives me hope that mindless human destruction and loss aren't inevitable, that we can, in fact, choose to change and to save the world. So let me move from this opening salvo of information for you to describing for you how the book begins. And one of the reasons I think I kind of feel compelled to read this is because I've never done this with a book before, and that is writing the very first pages as a beginning act of starting a book. Usually I come back and write the beginning of a book after I've finished everything. But in this particular case, the first words that I put down have remained the beginning of this book. And I'll tell you maybe a little bit more about this as the evening goes on. Let me get a swig of water and I'll start this. So the introduction is titled All is Vanity, which for those of you who have read the book know that this is from Ecclesiastes. It was the lead up to a presidential election, an unsettling late summer for many Americans since the hugely popular incumbent, Theodore Roosevelt, was declining to run for president a second time. The national gossip centered around whether portly William Howard Taft, who Roosevelt handpicked as his successor at Chicago's Republican convention that June of 1908, could possibly follow the charismatic advocate of the strenuous life. Somehow Taft seemed an unlikely replacement for the president who does not shrink from danger, from hardship. So the news story out of the remote Southwest late that August of 1908 initially seemed little more than a momentary distraction from politics, even if for some it might have been a reminder of the kind of heroic leadership the country was losing. What the nation read in its newspapers was that on the night of August 27th, a 65-year-old telephone operator named Sally Rook had gotten a call that an immense thunderstorm hovering over the Colorado-New Mexico border had spawned a flash flood in the dry Cimarron River. With a debris-choked wall of water ripping straight for the town of Folsom, New Mexico, Rook had spent a crucial half hour frantically calling every local number on her switchboard, saving scores of people. Then the flood had torn through Folsom and swept her away, along with half the town. Sally Rook's heroism became a national story. Telephone operators around the country contributed thousands of dimes for a memorial. But eventually the story faded from the papers. Folsom had imagined itself competing with Colorado Springs 100 miles up the Rockies, but the town never recovered. Today, Colorado Springs has 500,000 people. Folsom has 80. In the days immediately following the dry Cimarron flood, an African-American cowboy named George McJunkin was riding through grassy parkland a few hundred yards below the rimrock of a miles-long mesa that extended eastward from the Rocky Mountains. He was checking for ranch fence lines damaged by the flood. Suddenly, McJunkin's horse braced, its hooves furrowing into foot-deep mud at the edge of a ragged scar floodwaters had cut into the slope below the mesa. McJunkin leaned out of his saddle to peer into a fresh chasm sliced into the brown shale. What he saw changed the story of America forever. This, then, is when Americans learn that we have a deep time history. That native people had not arrived only a couple thousand years before Europeans had gotten here, but in fact had been here for, well, no one knew how long, because in the early decades of the 20th century, we did not yet have radiocarbon dating. And so Jesse Figgins, the archaeologist who came down from Denver to work this site, which included extinct bison, believed that that Folsom site was probably 450,000 years old. When it was finally radiocarbon dated, it turned out to be 10,450 years old. But that gave America a deep time history, something that could match Europe's deep time history. And it began our first acknowledgement that we had a story that extended back into the mists of time on the planet. So at that point, I think I will go and join Sara, and we'll see what happens.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's always a challenge to try to figure out how to frame the entire argument that you managed to lay out in a book. So good job on you. And if you don't mind, what I'd like to do is ask you some questions that in some ways riff off of what you've already talked about, but then also just some things that, as I've read the book, I was particularly intrigued by. And one of the things you mentioned in your opening comments was that Native people were able to live for at least 10,000 years in an essentially sustainable ecological relationship. And you're not being overly romantic about this idea. So how did this work? How is that possible?
Well, that's right. I try to be objective and careful and fair-minded about this 10,000-year period. It's a period that follows what's called the Pleistocene extinctions, when we did lose a large group, as many as 32 genera of America's most charismatic animals. This is when we lost mammoths and saber-toothed cats. All of our horses disappeared. Our camels disappeared. All these animals that, like horses and camels, that had evolved here, and some like mammoths and saber-toothed cats that had come here from other parts of the world, particularly Asia. But at the conclusion of that period, which ends at the beginning of what's known as in the geological time frame as the Holocene, or what some people these days are referring to as the Anthropocene, we have a span of time, and an extraordinarily long span of time, 10,000 years, where Native people occupy the continent and occupy what is now Mexico, the United States, and Canada thoroughly, and yet preserve almost all the biodiversity of the fauna that they had inherited from the Pleistocene. There is, in fact, one extinction during that period. Native people over that 10,000 years don't manage to have a spotless record. A flightless sea duck from the Pacific coast does become extinct during this period about 2,500 years ago. So it took 7,500 years during or after the Pleistocene for that extinction to take place. But by and large, Native people do preserve the diversity that's found on the continent. And that's even with the emergence of agriculture, which, I mean, to sort of give you a sense of how this all plays out, in the old world, in Eurasia and the Middle East, the Neolithic age, the age of agriculture, begins something like 10,000 years or so ago. And between 10,000 years ago and down to about 7,000 or 6,000 years ago, many of the animals we think of as domesticated animals today become a part of the cultural set in the old world. That revolution, the agricultural revolution, is delayed in the Americas largely because it's not necessary to go beyond hunting and gathering for a very long time. But even with the last couple of thousand years before Europeans arrived of an agricultural revolution in the Americas, one of the things that helps contribute to the preservation of this biological diversity is that the population of what is now the United States and Canada never rises above about 5 million people. There is a map, which we'll probably show somewhere behind us here, that shows the populations of the various cultural regions of North America. And if you add those figures up, it comes to less than 5 million people. That, of course, is in a place where now, the United States and Canada, we have a population of almost 400 million people. So the population remains small, and one of the reasons it does is because Native people very deliberately do that. They understand, because the feedback loops in ecology were short, that you had to make sure that you didn't overextend yourself ecologically. And there were certain instances, certain animals, for example, passenger pigeons being one, bison being another, and I describe these stories in some detail in the book, where the size of the prey base is so large that it's impossible for a human predator base to really diminish it very much. With a population of fewer than 5 million people, it's not possible for the numbers of people east of the Mississippi River to diminish passenger pigeons, and it's not possible on the Great Plains for that to happen with bison either. So that population figure, a kind of a materialist cause, is one reason. Another one, though, that I spend a good bit of time about is the preservation that Native people in the Americas seem to bring to the game of how they view themselves vis-a-vis other creatures. And I offer up several examples. We've got some outstanding examples of this, in fact, many of them done by Native American scholars. But in effect, what I'm describing is an idea that Native people have, that they are kin to all other creatures, that other creatures have families, communities, leaders, just like humans do. And so part of the phenomenon has to do with this sense that other animals are the same as us. I describe in the book, and I alluded to this in my opening presentation, a range of ceremonies that people do. I mean, I'll just offer you one example. On the Great Plains, among bison hunters, there were times in the past when bison became few. And the way Native people encouraged bison to return. For one thing, their cause-effect idea about why bison would become fewer, become hard to find, was that something had disrupted the kinship arrangement between people and animals. And so they would do ceremonies in order to reassure the animals, reassure bison herds, for example, that humans still regarded themselves as kin. Some of those ceremonies featured faux marriages between humans and people dressed as bison. They featured a variety of different ways to make sure that the animals understood that humans didn't think of themselves as separate from other creatures of the planet. And as you know, in my opening remarks, I contrasted that with the sort of ideology that Europeans brought to the game.
Well, and so to pick up on that, the book is called Wild New World as opposed to Old World. And yet much of this book is the story of how Europeans come here, and as fast as they possibly can, they try to transform the New World into the Old World that they're supposedly leaving. Why? And I will ask, sort of as the follow-up of that too, I mean, why did they do that, and what are the consequences for such a transformation?
Well, I think in reference to a comment I made in the introduction about this continental first contact idea. It's based on a theory about first contact that the only way you can interpret new conditions is through the ideas that you already have. Over time, you come to recognize that you can change your behavior and your thinking, but the only way to react to a brand new circumstance is with what you bring to the game. And so what Europeans come to America with is a tradition of 8,000 years of domesticating animals, herding animals, something that native people, by the way, never did. I mean, there's some domesticated animals, obviously, domesticated wild turkeys, for example, dogs, and several others. But in the Americas, in what is now the United States in particular, there were no people who had domesticated herd animals among native people. Europeans have been doing this for 8,000 or 9,000 years, though. And so they come armed with this long-standing tradition of despising predatory animals of every kind. And in some cases, particular European groups had absolutely no experience with predators before they arrived in the Americas. The British, for example, had destroyed all the wolves in Great Britain by the 1400s. And so they've gone for 200 years without any experiences with wolves whatsoever, other than the sort of fairy tales and folk traditions that people told about wolves. So it won't surprise you, by the way, that the very first act, the first environmental law that any European group passes in America is a bounty on wolves. And that happens within about 3 years after the Puritans arrive at Massachusetts Bay in the 1620s. So it's this old idea, as Aldo Leopold, who saw all this, and I write in the book, I think Leopold saw this more clearly than anybody else did, earlier than anybody else did. He saw it as early as the 1940s for certain. And he realized that what we were trying to do to manage wildlife, how we were treating wildlife in America, was based on these folk traditions that people had brought from the old world. As he said in a review of the Stanley Young and E.A. Goldman book, North American Wolves, that came out in the early 1940s. Leopold reviewed that book for the Journal of Mammalogy, and he said, these guys aren't really doing science about the relationship between wolves, wild animals, and even stock. They're just relying on this kind of handed down folk tradition. And it's not modern scientific management, particularly in a world, as I mentioned in my introduction, where the United States has created a vast public land system that's nothing like any European nation has. So what Leopold saw in the early 1940s was that we had had a chance to do something different. We had had a wonderful opportunity to preserve the wild in a way that no European nation had, and yet we had simply followed this European model and had wiped out all the predators we could, made it so that buffalo could not be wild animals in America any longer, wiped out passenger pigeons. I mean, I talk in the book about when the last passenger pigeon, Martha, died in 1914. Almost no American newspapers ran an obituary about Martha or passenger pigeons. And one of the ones that did, the New York World, had this to say: we should be thankful that the passenger pigeon has decided not to stay with us the way the grasshopper is. I mean, that kind of perspective on this marvelous collection of creatures that Europeans had inherited from millions of years before is what ended up giving us this really a world that had lost much of its magic by the 20th century, so that almost the only animals we were interested in preserving were the ones that people wanted to hunt. So we preserved white-tailed deer, we preserved various upland game birds, waterfowl like ducks and geese. Everything else we were perfectly willing to sacrifice, because this is the way they did it in the old world, don't you know?
Well, and that's one of the things that I think comes through really powerfully in the book, is how European introduction of the market economy and the commodification of nature just plays out in such a relatively short period of time, with an unfortunate, atrocious, really, consistency. And so I know that one story I think some people know something about is the bison story. They're at least familiar with, we had a bunch of them, then we almost had none of them, and now we can buy them at the grocery store again. So, but your argument in this book is that, in fact, that's just a very small piece of the bison story. It's more complicated than that, and it's also far more diagnostic of what was happening to a much broader range of wildlife. So talk a little bit about that. How does the bison story, in fact, tell us a whole lot about this time period and this valuation of the market?
Okay, and I'll try not to go too long, because this bison story is a complex one.
If you do, I'll...
Yeah, okay, yeah. Yank me off the stage. So the bison story is one I tell in a chapter called Silence and Emptiness. And it's a chapter about this massive destruction of wildlife that takes place largely in the years after the Civil War, between the 1860s and the 1930s or so. And much of that destruction takes place, as Professor Dant has indicated, as a result of market forces. I mean, we Europeans arrive in the Americas with the idea that animals have been delivered to us by primarily the religion we bring to the colonial experience. Most Europeans follow a Judeo-Christian tradition which teaches one that humans are exceptional, that, as Genesis puts it, unto your hand are they delivered, speaking of all other animals. Those animals can function in any manner that Europeans designate, and one of the manners in which Europeans decide to fold America's animals into the colonial enterprise is through the market economy. In effect, we look at creatures like beavers, and you'll all recognize that story, another one most people can remember from their history. Sea otters, fur seals, passenger pigeons, bison, and a host of others, all kinds of waterfowl, as commodities in a global market. And the idea simply is that governments have no right to intervene in an ordinary citizen's ability to make money off whatever wildlife anyone happens to find at their disposal. I mean, I write in the book in several different instances of people rural people in particular, who often can only function in the guise of a market economy where you need cash by killing animals, by killing shorebirds, snowy egrets, for example, for the plume trade. And this is something that people all over America do from the 1600s to the late 1900s. And no governments really are capable of intervening. Again and again, Americans regard being able to do this as their franchise. It's part of the right you inherit as being an American, that you get to kill as many animals as you want and sell them on the market. And so the buffalo stands as the prime example of how all this worked. I mean, I do describe in the book that we had a former buffalo hide hunter in the early 20th century who wrote a memoir about his experiences on the Buffalo Plains, who managed to convince a lot of people for a lot of the 20th century that it was our own government that destroyed the buffalo. And the buffalo, this particular hide hunter said, was such an important creature for Native people that the government came up with a secret plan augmented by the American military to wipe out buffalo after the Civil War in order to control Native people. The particular guy who did this, John Cook was his name, the book was called The Border and the Buffalo, basically tried to put together the description of how this was an act of civilization, and the people who had shot down the last 10 or 12 million buffalo, hide hunters like himself, had actually been agents of the government who ought to be given medals for their work on behalf of civilization. The truth of the matter is, there was never a conspiracy to do that. The federal government was too weak and ineffective to come up with a plan like that to start with. What the government did, in fact, was to simply stand back and let the market economy do its work. And when the market economy is turned loose on animals, this is true in our own time as well as in the 19th century, that economy is fully capable of wiping out one species after another. And that's precisely what happened. Passenger pigeons, great auks, Carolina parakeets, ivory-billed woodpeckers, and bison, and pronghorns nearly, all became extinct or nearly so in this same period between the 1870s and the 1930s.
Well, and one of the things that you do in this book, I mean, so you're talking about economics right now, and you do a really kind of astonishing discussion of Adam Smith and not just his economic law of the market and supply and demand. I'll save that for you to read later. Buy the book out front now. But this is economics, this is genomic science, this is anthropology, it's archaeology, it's history. It's a really remarkable coming together in your head and then out in this wonderful format. And I think the thing that drives this book forward so compellingly is the stories that you tell. I mean, you could make this one of those wah, 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 wah kind of books, but it's not like that at all. It's a great read. And so obviously you can't tell all the stories, but maybe a couple of stories. What did you really like? What kind of stories did you really enjoy telling in this book?
Well, when you have 66 million years to cover, you have a lot of possibilities. So, one of the early ones I like, and I was intrigued. I will say, by the way, that in terms of how the book rests, the body of it, and the weight of it, there are 3 chapters that cover the early period from 66 million years ago down to that 10,000 year span of time that I described a few minutes ago. And then the last 7 chapters cover from the time Old Worlders arrive in the Americas. So the weight of the book is actually sort of on the later period. But there are some really great stories in that early period. I'll just tell you a couple of them from that long ago time in America. One of them that I didn't know until I began to research the Chicxulub Impact was that impact was such a powerful hit. I mean, this asteroid was 7.5 miles in diameter, and it was traveling at 27,000 miles an hour. And it hit basically in what would now be the Gulf of Mexico. Some of you've perhaps seen an image on the screen behind us where America is divided into 2 pieces. That's what it looked like. A vast interior seaway in North America, Appalachia, America on one side, Laramidia, America in the west, and the Gulf of Mexico just below America is where this impact took place. It hit with such force that the ejecta from the impact exited Earth's gravity well. And there are astrobiologists who believe that on a planet that was brimming with life, an impact that tossed ejecta beyond the orbit or beyond the gravity well of Earth into the solar system may have seeded Earth's life in the form of microbes over much of the solar system, as far out as places like the moons of Saturn and Jupiter. I mean, we're not going to know that, of course, until we make a determination of whether there's life on a moon like Enceladus orbiting Saturn and whether that life has any relationship to earthly life. But there's a possibility that impact was actually a genesis impact for the solar system. And, of course, it was an impact that almost destroyed much of life on Earth. Another story from that early period that I really have been intrigued by because of what it says about the ability of the early humans who got to North America. In this case, it's the Clovis people, and how good they were at what they did, at the economy that they brought here. And it was an economy, by the way, that humans had been practicing for 40,000 generations, which is probably why these people were so good at this. But it's a story from the Santa Cruz River, south of present-day Tucson, from about 11,000 years ago, where archaeologists in our own time have found 3 different sites that all seem to be related to one another. The first site appeared to show where a herd of mammoths had bunched together and Clovis hunters had surrounded them, and in that herd were 13 adolescents and calves, the remains of which were found butchered in the site where they were killed with 1 Clovis point in each animal. 13 Clovis points for 13 animals. Then they found 8 miles away a mammoth cow with 8 Clovis points in her. She clearly had fought to the end to defend those calves, and after being stabbed with 8 Clovis point spears had finally run away and succumbed. And they found the bull too. He had 2 points in him, and he had also fled the scene. But it's an indication to me of just how good these Clovis hunters were at what they did. Now, I don't necessarily argue in that particular chapter that it's the Clovis hunters who wipe out the Pleistocene animals. It's not that simple. And genomic evidence seems to indicate as much. What we probably think is that some of those animals were driven into small populations that were so far apart that they were unable to exchange genetic information, and they perhaps perished as a result of what's known as genomic meltdown, which is what happened to those mammoths on Wrangel Island. That's a story that from the Clovis period has always struck me as a kind of remarkable one. But there are tons of others. I mean, coming down in the time period, one of the ones I really love because I spent a lot of time with these characters, I describe Vernon Bailey, famous naturalist in 20th century America that many of you will know, who married Florence Miriam Bailey, his boss's sister. Clinton Hart Miriam was the director of the U.S. Biological Survey, and Vernon Bailey was working with him. That story is a story of a young man, in Vernon Bailey's case, not very well educated, but really good at trapping animals, who becomes a master naturalist, probably the best 20th century naturalist we have, who marries a woman who is supremely well educated, has gone to Smith College, has become an author of bird books at a time when, for one thing, not many women were writing books about natural history. But the two of those people, Vernon Bailey and Florence Miriam, are married when both are well on. I mean, they're in their 30s when they finally marry for the first and only time. And Bailey has been converted into a wolf hunter and killer by his boss, C. Hart Miriam. And he is really good at it. He's the person who goes around and explains to Forest Service managers, Park Service managers, how to kill wolves, how to poison them, how to find the dens and kill all the pups. Florence, on the other hand, seems to exert a very different influence on Vernon Bailey. The two of them, by the way, do their honeymoon in New Mexico. She writes the first book about western birds, the birds of New Mexico, and later writes a book about the birds of the American West. But all during this time, when they are celebrated writers and naturalists in America, she seems to be working a change in Vernon Bailey so that by the end of his life, he not only comes to invent a series of traps, the verbale traps that catch animals without harming them, but in his papers that are at the University of Wyoming, scholars have discovered a picture of a wolf in a trap and Vernon Bailey's handwritten note beside it that begins, okay, so he may have killed a cow to eat, but did he really deserve this? Vernon Bailey transitions over the course of his life from being the man Teddy Roosevelt called Wolf Bailey to becoming someone who finally began to show compassion for these animals that he had taught so many people how to kill. And that's a story that covers 2 chapters in the book because these two people are present for a lot of the events of 20th century America, especially when American mammalogists and ecologists are beginning to discover the role that wolves have played in ecologies in America for so very long. And so it's a story that I particularly like in the book.
I want to make sure that we have time to get to some of the questions that people sent in. But before we do, I'll do this on all your behalfs. Inquiring minds want to know, what did your mother say about Chickie? Right?
Oh, yeah.
You left us all hanging with that one.
I didn't finish that story, did I?
No.
Well, so I'll remind you, we're in the backyard, and my mother and I are both crying as we put my little chicken, as I recall, in a cigar box or something, and buried her in the yard. And so I asked Mother. In effect, the question was, will Chickie and I get to have one another again in heaven? And my mother, who was a very remarkable woman, but who was famous all her life, at least in the family, for sort of presenting the unpainted version of things, even to a 4-year-old, says to me, "Why, no, honey, you're not going to see Chickie in heaven. You're made in the image of God, and you have an immortal soul. Chickie is just an animal. Animals don't get to go to heaven." So we buried my little chicken, and I walked away, and no doubt the reason this is my oldest memory is because it's associated with an emotional reaction. I walk away with this idea in my head that the other creatures around me in the world are not like me. I'm different from all the rest of them. And I can tell you somehow, even at 4 years old, that just didn't seem right or correct. But I knew it was the way everyone around me viewed the world because of the ideology that they had brought to this relationship.
Well, and I think that's a really powerful current that runs through this book, is this idea that we are one species among many, and yet the way we have interacted with other species has been challenging. So one of the questions that someone wrote in and asked was about the role of zoos. And in the book, you talk about the really critical role that the Bronx Zoo played in preventing bison extinction. And so this question asks, what role should well-run, peer-acknowledged zoos play in the preservation of various species? And if these zoos have active species propagation programs, is it not possible that by the next human generation, many endangered species will not only be able to be viewed and perhaps have some level of interaction at these locations? Okay, yeah, that's an excellent question, and I will say, to prepare you to accept what I'm about to go on and describe here, that the book for sure talks in many cases, in a number of cases, not just bison, where William Temple Hornaday in particular at the Bronx Zoo managed to not only preserve bison from as many places on the Great Plains as he could find them, but one of the things he realized was that you had to contact people who had remnants of the Southern Plains herd, the Northern Plains herd, and you had to exchange animals back and forth in order to increase biological diversity. I mean, there was not a good sense about genetic diversity at the time, but people understood from having bred animals for a long time that you needed to provide some diversity there. So
That was sort of the bison story that I tell and a role that the Bronx Zoo plays in that particular story. But I also talk about the role that zoos played. For example, the zoo in Tacoma, Washington, was critical in helping to rescue and preserve endangered red wolves from the South. I talk about the role that zoos play and still play, and they still play a role with red wolves today, where we have many more red wolves that are in zoos in captivity than we have in the wild. We only have about 20 or 25 red wolves in the wild these days. It's the most endangered wolf in the world at the moment. But I also talked about California condors, and the same story obtains. Zoos were really critical in getting condors restored to 3 or 4 different places around the country, the Southwest, California, of course, up in the Pacific Northwest, where there's been a lot of tribal assistance. The Miwoks in particular have been major players in helping restore California condors. But again, we have a large population, more than 200 condors in zoos as a backup population. So this is kind of the way that has played out.
Mexican wolves is another example, right?
Mexican wolves is another example. Black-footed ferrets, another example. Virtually all of our black-footed ferrets, in fact, are in captivity. And so the question, I think, is an appropriate one about the future. It's very likely that this is how we're going to be able to preserve creatures. And one of the mysteries, of course, is why no one did this in the early 20th century with passenger pigeons or with Carolina parakeets. I mean, why did it not occur to someone to try to do this? The last birds of both species were in zoos, to be sure, but there were no real active breeding programs to try to propagate those species. What I would say, though, is that I tend to be more an advocate of animals in the wild. And so among the environmental groups that I work with, one is called American Prairie up in Montana, and their sole goal is to create a province that's 2.5 times the size of Yellowstone on the Great Plains to correct our error of never getting a Great Plains park with all these wonderful Serengeti-like creatures out on the American Great Plains. And their goal at some point in the 21st century is to have buffalo, grizzlies, wolves, all the creatures of the American Great Plains restored to that region as wild animals. And so I applaud the effort, no question, that zoos have made towards preserving endangered species, but to me the goal is to still get animals out into the wild.
Well, and I appreciate that. You're really helping me transition to the next question. Most of the other questions here you've kind of addressed already, so let me just make this the last question and then you can wrap things up. But one ancient and modern animal that could probably start a fight in an empty bar is wild horses. And as one person stated in their question, we manage all sorts of animals, if imperfectly, to minimize or mitigate habitat destruction. Elk, cows, prairie dogs, feral pigs, cats and dogs, but not wild horses. So, are they native or exotic? And what are your thoughts about the controversies that swirl around them today in 2 minutes or less?
Yeah, I'll do this in 2 minutes or less. And this is another one that, sort of like the book itself, could have been 1,200 pages instead of 400. This is a story that could go on for a long time. But first, I will say this. Horses evolved in America. I mean, you've probably seen on the screen behind me, I know there's a map in the batch that shows all the paleontological sites of horses in North America. They were all over the continent. They evolved here 56 million years ago, were present in forms virtually identical to modern horses down to, some people think, 8,000 years ago. During that time, of course, they had migrated across the land bridges, got into Asia, got into Africa, became zebras, became Przewalski's horses in Asia, and became the animals that Europeans domesticated before almost wiping them out as hunting prey. So they are, without question, long-term American animals. In fact, the reason they did so well when Europeans brought them back here and they got loose, of course, Santa Fe from the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 is one of the places that distributes horses all across the West. The reason they do so well is because they are completely pre-adapted to the landscape. This is where they had evolved. I will say that if you think about the horse as being a native animal with an asterisk, here for 56 million years, gone for 8,000 years, and then returned, put that against the American bison. Our only national mammal, by the way, we only have two animals that are national creatures, the bald eagle and the bison, designated by Barack Obama in 2016 as such. We think the bison has only been in America for 250,000 years. Our national mammal is actually, compared to horses, a really latecomer. But the problem, of course, is that animals have to be preserved usually with their ecologies intact around them. And what we have ended up with are wild horses in a continent where we have obliterated all the predators that used to help control their populations. Without a good complement of lions and wolves taking out horse colts, we're left with what the BLM does these days, which is round them up and hold them in holding pens until they can sell them to people who, after having them for a year, take them off to slaughterhouses. That's obviously untenable. And unfortunately, there aren't too many other really good options. I mean, one option that I talk about in the book is the idea of birth control, collecting horses, giving the mares and stallions both birth control rather than just gathering up horses and holding them in holding pens. But that, of course, would be costly and arduous and time-consuming.
And nature tends to find a way.
And nature tends to find a way indeed. So this is one of the reasons, by the way, I argue in the book that the idea of bringing back through de-extinction mammoths, saber-toothed cats, anybody? Because if we bring back mammoths, you're going to have to come up with some sort of strategy in nature to control their populations. And that usually means something like a big predator. Okay, so we're nearing the end here. I will do one more thing from the book itself. I want to read you, since I read you the first page and a half, I'll read you the last 2 pages of this book.
Because we're going to end up.
Hopefully, yes. So, the last piece of Wild New World, the epilogue, is titled, "How Are You Enjoying the Anthropocene?" And it delves into all these things that most of us know from the contemporary world. A quarter of the species on the planet confronting extinction. 75% of the species in North America having suffered the loss of at least half their ranges. 30% of the birds that we had in the 1970s now gone, on and on. And I started basically by going, because I talk a good bit about Thoreau and that idea of an entire heaven and an entire earth, I start this epilogue by going to Walden and walking around Walden and sort of communing with the ghosts of Thoreau. But here's how I decided to end the book. And I don't know whether this will work for you or not. It's not the only thing one should do. As I mentioned, I certainly am engaged with environmental organizations to try to save what's here. But Here's how I end this 398 pages of much of which seems like an elegy for what we've lost. Rather than mourn, I've tried to experience what's left. That's how I've attempted to cope with Thoreau's anguish and mine over the America we never got to see. So I've journeyed to the Arctic Wildlife Refuge to witness the grand summer migration of the porcupine caribou herd. I've spent afternoons in Nebraska watching rivers of gangly sandhill cranes pass overhead, enveloped in the aural waves of their primeval fluting, once catching the rare treat of a white whooping crane flying with them. I've hiked through grizzly country and met wild bears, once watching a big sow throw haymakers at circling gray wolves over ownership of an elk carcass as eagles and magpies hopped beyond reach, and the bear's 3 cubs sat shocked and bug-eyed. I've crept close enough to a bugling bull elk to hear the gurgling in his throat at the end of his whistles, and stood among grazing buffalo in all of William Temple Hornady's first bison refuges from a century ago. On afternoon runs in Montana, a bald eagle used to cock a reptilian eye as I passed beneath her cottonwood perch, and I returned the favor when she and her mate waddled about the pastures in early spring, eating new calf afterbirth. I've long been drawn to pronghorns, those gorgeous Pleistocene survivors, and one time saw a young buck turn himself sideways, running 50 miles an hour, clocked by car, so he could dart between strands of a wire fence. The impact, a thwanging explosion of white hairs drifting in the wind as he trotted off, daydreaming of cheetahs. Sitting on a yellow raft pontoon in the bottom of the otherworldly Grand Canyon, I've watched the California condor soaring the blue that will always be there. In the Nevada desert, I've nestled in the sagebrush with binoculars and laughed to myself as a wild stallion, so black he had to turn at an angle before I could see his sleek musculature, run himself ragged chasing equine Don Juans away from his harem of flirtatious mares. Trumpeter swans sailing Montana's 7,000-foot Centennial Valley have awed me. So have sea otters along California's central coast. So have red-tailed hawks, a biologist friend and I once banded, one of them taking flight while my hands still grasped its feet, the closest I've ever come to feeling like I was flying. So have winter dancers at Jemez Pueblo in New Mexico, who perfectly, uncannily mimic the movements of mule deer, eagles, buffalo. Sipping coffee in my kitchen, I've watched the miracle of coyotes gliding past the windows the way coyotes go through the world, every hair on their pointed muzzles and upright ears crisply backlit by raking chromium yellow light. I've never seen a cougar, though, anywhere. I'm heading to Florida to look for Florida panthers, hoping for one glimpse of my natal Southland's secretive big cats. I've been wolf lucky, though. Except for 2 decades I spent in Texas, I've had wolves everywhere I've lived. I grew up with red wolves, at least rangy red wolf coyote hybrids in Louisiana. I got to experience gray wolf recovery in Montana. Where I live today near Santa Fe, I know that Mexican wolves recently released into New Mexico's Black Range are at least pretty close. In my one state that lacked wolves, I introduced them. In the 1990s, I raised a pair of wolf Malamute hybrids and their litter in Yellow House Canyon in West Texas. That turned out to be a sin against wolves I didn't intend to commit. I've since moved on to wolfy Alaskan Malamutes. But my wolves live on in my mind. I can still conjure crouching in the dirt of their enclosure on a summer day as they repeatedly charged me, hurtling with such velocity and lack of wasted motion that while I should remember knife-edge detail, all I can pull up is a slur of cubist imagery, snatches of red open mouths, tongues streaming saliva, yellow eyes gyring in on me, the rush carried by a primal thumping rhythm punctuated by the clack of jaws as the female snaps at my ponytail when she surges past like a wave of black water. So the prescription I've come to seems to be this: know the heaven and the earth that was, but experience the world that is. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. And thanks to SARS for doing this. Thanks, sir.
Thank you, Dad and Sarah, for a memorable evening. Just a reminder that copies of their books are available, thanks to Collected Works, in the lobby, and they will be signing the ones that aren't already signed. And do please pick up a copy of the flyer that I showed, because it also lists a number of events for the next few months. Most of our events are free and open to the public, and I look forward to seeing you there. Have a nice evening.